Barbara Brodkin, who was 42 years old, was discovered dead in her Balliol Street apartment in Midtown Toronto early on Friday, March 19, 1993. Zachary, her 6-year-old son, found her close to her bedroom closet. She had been fatally stabbed in the chest and displayed signs of being strangled. The detectives had no idea that it would take them more than 30 years to solve this case. What caused this tragic incident, and who might have been responsible? Canada's bustling metropolis of Toronto is renowned for its stunning skyline, which features the recognizable CN Tower. The city's diverse population of nearly 2.8 million people contributes to its active way of life. Living in Toronto provides access to a variety of historic and recreational destinations. It is one of the most multicultural cities in the world because of the diversity of its residents' cultures. One of Toronto's distinctive qualities is its diversity. However, Toronto faces difficulties just like any other big city. Although relatively low when compared to other major cities, it still has a high crime rate, and it is in this setting that our story today began. Barbara Brodkin was born in the thriving city of Toronto on April 24, 1950. Although her early years were somewhat a mystery, Toronto served as her residence during those crucial years. Barbara first met Christopher Barry in the 1980s. They were immediately led down the aisle by their undeniable connection. When their son Zachary was born in 1987, their happiness increased. In the subsequent years, though, things began to go south. Christopher's actions changed. He started acting aloof and occasionally hostile. Barbara found the strength to leave the marriage for her son's sake, moving into a new apartment at 155 Balliol Street, which is located halfway between Mount Pleasant Road and Yonge Street. She juggled multiple responsibilities while working tirelessly as a secretary and typist to protect Zachary. She even dabbled in covert marijuana sales. Her main objective was to provide Zachary with the best life she could. Zachary was 6 years old in 1993, and Barbara was 42. In the hopes of better days ahead, mother and son were living life to the fullest. Unknown to them, however, a shadow lingered nearby and threatened to upend everything. The morning of March 19, 1993 in Toronto was ordinary as usual. As people left for their daily tasks, the city was bustling, but at the Brodkin home on Balliol Street, there was an unusual silence. Young Zachary, who was in first grade and only 6 years old, realized he had slept too much. It was unusual that his mother, Barbara, hadn't woken him up for school. Zachary started looking around the apartment for his mother in confusion. Why didn't she wake him up? He pushed the door open and went into her room, hoping to see her still asleep. Instead, he saw something that no child should ever have to see. Barbara's body was still and next to her closet in her bedroom. There was blood all around her. The closet door was half open and suggested a struggle. Zachary panicked and thought back to his mother's instructions for an emergency. He quickly dialed 911 on the home phone. When Zachary described the horrific scene, the operator, who had initially been dubious upon hearing a child's voice, quickly realized the seriousness of the situation. Within minutes, police cars converged on the Brodkin family's home, heralding the start of a case that would trouble Toronto for years to come. Balliol Street reverberated with the piercing sound of sirens. Barbara Brodkin's tragic death was thoroughly and quickly investigated. Rob Thomas, a constable, was the first to get to the scene. It was heartbreaking to see young Zachary alone, who appeared traumatized. Thomas hurriedly escorted the child outside, protecting him from the horrific scene inside his home. The immediate cordoning off of the area signaled the start of a thorough investigation. As more police officers and forensic specialists arrived at the Balliol Street apartment, they started to piece together what happened before Barbara died. A single fatal stab wound to her chest was discovered during the initial examination of her body. Uncomfortably, there were also marks on her neck that might indicate strangulation. Barbara had bravely fought her assailant, as evidenced by the scratches and defensive wounds on her hands and arms that painted a picture of a fierce struggle. Further details were revealed by the condition of the apartment. Barbara's bedroom was out of order compared to the rest of the house. The room had items lying around in an haphazard manner, and there were obvious signs of a violent altercation. The investigator noticed the open closet door and surmised that robbery might have been a motive. Finding out exactly what might have been stolen, though, proved difficult at first. A few days later, the results of the autopsy support the preliminary conclusions. Although the strangulation marks on Barbara's neck were obvious, the cause of death was a stab wound to the heart. The foreign DNA found under Barbara's fingernails was a significant discovery, indicating that she may have managed to scratch her attacker in her final moments. These nail clippings were carefully preserved in the hopes that it may hold the key to catching her killer. The focus of the investigation then turned to interviewing witnesses. Interviews were conducted with Barbara's friends, family, co-workers, neighbors, and anyone else who knew her. The detectives had a lot of leads to follow after more than 295 witnesses provided their accounts. The sale of marijuana by Barbara as a side job caught everyone's attention. This fact was significant because it raised the possibility that she might have interacted with some sketchy characters during this trade. Barbara kept her marijuana in a cosmetics case in her closet, according to further inquiries. Only $12 was discovered in her wallet, and there was no other cash in the apartment, and the cosmetics case was obviously missing from the crime scene. The detectives were certain that robbery played a significant role in the murder's motivation. This hypothesis was supported by the missing cosmetics case and the lack of additional cash. However, as the police followed up on more leads in an effort to connect any of Barbara's clients to any suspicious activity or the foreign DNA, they ran into a brick wall. Although there was no conclusive evidence connecting any of her clients to the crime, the investigation took a new turn when Barbara's close circle was questioned, and they suggested another possible suspect. This person's motive was entirely different, and it changed the course of the investigation. The detective's task at this point was to follow up on this new lead while being careful not to miss any other potential leads. A name kept coming up in the interviews with people close to Barbara Brodkin as the investigation into her death progressed. The name was Christopher Barry, Barbara's former husband and Zachary's father. Christopher became a person of interest in the eyes of the police due to the couple's turbulent past, which was highlighted by a contentious custody dispute over their son. The police looked into Christopher's past and found some concerning information. Christopher had a violent tendency during their marriage and frequently physically and verbally abused Barbara. His tendency to act violently was not only present in his relationship with Barbara. He had been charged with assault in a separate incident and had even threatened Barbara with death on several occasions, particularly during their contentious custody battles. Because of his closeness to Barbara, familiarity with her daily routines, an obvious motive, Christopher quickly rose to the position of top suspect in the investigation. The Toronto police interrogated Christopher over a number of sessions in an effort to learn more. Christopher resisted their attempts to get him to confess, as they interrogated him using a variety of techniques. He insisted that he had been with his girlfriend when the murder occurred. His girlfriend confirmed his alibi when the police contacted her, which complicated the investigation even more. The police suggested a polygraph test as a way to find out the truth. Without hesitation, Christopher agreed and ultimately aced the exam. Despite being frustrated, the investigators still had one card to play: to compare Christopher's DNA with the foreign DNA discovered under Barbara's fingernails. They requested samples of his hair and saliva from him. They were surprised when he immediately agreed. The samples were quickly sent for testing, while the police eagerly awaited the results. They had faith that this would be the crucial turning point, but the outcomes fell short of their expectations. The sample's DNA did not match the DNA that was discovered at the crime scene. The investigation suffered a serious setback as a result of this revelation. The police had no choice but to release Christopher because there was no conclusive evidence connecting him to the crime, and his alibi was still valid. Even though they were unable to corroborate it, he continued to be a top suspect in the eyes of many detectives. The leads eventually started to disappear as time went on. The once exciting investigation began to falter. The detectives had been hopeful of cracking the case, but they eventually hit a brick wall, and the case was left unsolved for close to 25 years. Although the Barbara Brodkins case was still an eerie mystery for young Zachary, the suffering and memories were still very recent. At the tender age of 6, the shock of finding his mother's lifeless body left a scar that never fully recovered. Zachary tried to advance as he grew older. He started a family and dealt with the aftermath of that terrible day. A glimmer of hope appeared in 2017. The Barbara Brodkin case was reopened by the Toronto Police Department, and in a turn of events that seemed almost scripted by fate, Rob Thomas was assigned as the lead detective. The same Rob Thomas who had been the first to arrive at the Brodkin home years earlier as a young detective. Rob Thomas had a strong emotional connection to the case because he was the department's top polygraph officer at this point in his career, and he had gained experience over the years. He would never be able to get rid of the image of a scared and distraught young Zachary. He was determined to solve this long-running puzzle. In the case's archives, Rob Thomas and his team combed through old case files in search of any overlooked information or missed connections. They initially considered re-interviewing Barbara's ex-husband, Christopher Barry, but they soon learned that Christopher had passed away in 2009, which put an end to that line of inquiry. The physical evidence from the crime scene, particularly the DNA found under Barbara's fingernails, provided the investigators with another lead that they followed up on. They hoped that improvements in forensic science would allow them to obtain a more precise DNA profile. The samples had been stored for more than 20 years and were now being delivered to the Forensic Science Center. The outcomes looked promising. A unique DNA profile was created. The team went to the National DNA Database of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police with this new piece of information in hand. DNA samples from criminals who had been convicted nationwide were stored in this database. The team was optimistic despite the slim chances. Despite all odds, a match was discovered. The DNA belonged to a man by the name of Charles Mustard. He was a person who had never come up during the initial investigation. This insight was revolutionary. For the first time in 24 years, there was a new prime suspect in the case. The detectives started looking into Charles Mustard's past right away. They discovered a number of unsettling facts and trends that combined to form a terrifying picture. The search for the truth about Barbara Brodkin's tragic death had taken many twists and turns, but this fresh lead gave hope for justice. Charles William Mustard, who was born in 1954, experienced both privilege and pressure in his life. He was the youngest of the 7 children born to Dr. William Mustard, a well-known Toronto surgeon, and his wife Ellis Dr. William. His father was a heart surgery pioneer who earned the Order of Canada and a spot in the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. But in addition to his achievements and accolades, he was a strict and demanding father. The Mustard family ran their home with military efficiency. Dr. Williams had high standards, and he wasn't above using unusual punishments to instill discipline, like plunging a sluggish child into a chilly lake. Charles, however, had access to the best education money could buy despite his strict upbringing. Throughout his early years, he attended prestigious private and boarding schools. Later, he pursued a career in education and graduated from Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, with degrees in physical education and education. His wife, whose name was kept a secret, was someone he met while he was attending university. She was an aspirant teacher just like him. Early in the 1990s, Charles, who is now a father of 2, began working as an elementary school teacher in the southern Ontario town of Thornhill. His life, however, took a dark turn when he was taken into custody at a nearby mall on multiple counts of barbaric assault. His job was lost due to this incident. He ran into Barbara around this time and bought some marijuana from her. Detectives later proposed that Charles's decision to rob and then kill Barbara may have been motivated by financial stress as a result of losing his job. For Charles, the 1990s were turbulent. He was sentenced to prison for his assault in 1993. Disappointed and worried about their kids, his wife left him 2 years later. In the following 15 years, Charles' criminal history grew. Between 1993 and 2007, he received 12 convictions for his crimes against women. 2011 saw the theft that was his most recent offense. Charles' DNA was entered into Canada's national database in 2002 as a result of his numerous arrests. By 2017, when the Toronto Police Department reopened Barbara's case, this entry would prove crucial. When they compared the DNA they had discovered under her fingernails to the national database, they discovered Charles Mustard immediately. Charles's life had further descended into chaos by 2018. He was discovered to be reliant on Ontario disability support payments and living in subsidized housing in downtown Toronto. The Barbara Brodkin cold case underwent a sea change after the DNA match was made. The Toronto police were confident enough to make an arrest on October 18, 2018, in light of the newly discovered evidence and Charles Mustard's troubling past. Under the guise of having him sign some paperwork, they called Mustard to the Toronto Police Department's headquarters. They strategically placed sizable Barbara pictures in the lobby while closely observing Mustard's response to it. He appeared to be paying close attention to the pictures. Charles Mustard was formally detained the following day, on Friday, October 19, 2018, and charged with Barbara Brodkin's murder. A few months later, the matter quickly went to trial, which was presided over by Justice Brian O'Mara of the Ontario Superior Court. However, the trial took longer than 5 years and was anything but quick. Mustard insisted on his innocence throughout the entire trial. He portrayed Barbara and him as friendly acquaintances who shared a love for marijuana. He asserted that the last time he saw her was when he bought some marijuana on the side. He pretended not to know who Barbara was when asked about his close examination of her pictures at the police station. Given that Mustard had previously referred to Barbara as a friend, Justice O'Mara immediately characterized this as an obvious lie. The DNA evidence was the center of the prosecution's case. Mustard made an effort to explain it away by speculating that the DNA fusion may have originated from their joint of marijuana that they shared. This was disputed by forensic professionals who claimed that such a casual interaction wouldn't leave any noticeable DNA traces under a person's fingernails. Mustard's defense tried desperately to place the blame on Christopher Barry, Barbara's ex-husband, by bringing up his history of abuse, but the prosecution was ready. They cited Christopher Barry's alibi and the fact that the DNA samples taken at the crime scene did not match Barry's. On February 23, 2023, Justice Brian O'Mara announced the verdict following a protracted trial. Barbara Brodkin was killed by Charles Mustard, who is now 69, and he was found guilty of second-degree murder. His release on bail was immediately revoked, and he was arrested. The hearing on Mustard's sentence, which took place on Wednesday, April 5, 2023, marked the end of this protracted case's final chapter. He was given a 15-year term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was given in the Ontario Superior Court by Justice Brian O'Mara. Justice O'Mara asked Charles Mustard if he had any comments before delivering his punishment. Mustard got up from his chair to deny that he had killed Brodkin. He mentioned that he thought of Brodkin as a friend. In fact, they had a conversation the night before she died. In front of the judge, Mustard proclaimed, Though I might meet my end in prison, I'm not scared of death. I stand here innocent." Justice eventually caught up with Charles Mustard after 3 long decades. He likely believed he had escaped the law for more than 20 years because he wasn't even a glimpse on the police's radar. But justice has a way of catching up. Rob Thomas, the policeman who first arrived on the scene of the crime in 1993, was crucial to the new investigation. During the formal announcement of the conviction, Detective Sergeant Stacy Gallant commended him for his dedication. Zachary, who was only 6 years old when he found his mother's dead body, is now 36 and has his own family. He will always carry the scars from that terrible day. Zachary, now going by the name Zachary Hefner, described the terrifying incident in a heartbreaking statement that was read aloud in court. "The moment I entered that door is when my entire life changed. It took my 6-year-old mind several minutes to fully take in and understand the horror of what I was looking at. My mother was dead." Barbara's cousin, Herb Brodkin, spoke on the family's behalf after the conviction. He said, "I thought it was a very well-reasoned verdict. I'm very proud of the judge for what he did." He thanked the Toronto police for their unwavering dedication to the investigation, which provided the family with much-needed closure. Herb added, "Up until recently, I thought cold cases were just something that happened in a TV series in the States. What do you all think about this case? Share your thoughts with us in the comments." In 1998, Renee Sweeney, then 23 years old, resided in Sudbury. Sudbury is a city in Ontario, Canada. Renee was a Laurentian University music student who supplemented her education by working at an adult video store. When no one else was around at the store, she could complete her homework because it was quiet and fit into her schedule. Renee was working at the Paris Street video store on January 27, 1998. Just before 11 in the morning, a man came into the store and went up to the counter. After giving Renee 30 stab wounds, he stole $200 from the cash register. After that, the man went to clean up in the restroom. The man was shocked to discover Renee was still alive when he came out of the restroom. She was attempting to dial the emergency number on the phone behind the counter. The man decided to complete his evil deed. There was an intense struggle between him and Renee. During the struggle, Renee succeeded in scratching the man, but sadly, her wounds proved fatal. The man was observed running from the shop. Large volumes of evidence were gathered from the scene by the police who arrived on the scene shortly after. A lightweight windbreaker-style jacket and white cotton gloves that belonged to the suspect were found nearby in a wooded area by police tracking dogs. Renee's fingernails and the store restroom both had the offender's DNA on them. Seeing the unidentified man fleeing from the store, witnesses were able to provide investigators with a comprehensive account. He was described as being white, in his early 20s, with short dark hair, weighing between 140 and 150 pounds, standing between 5 and 6 feet tall, and having a slim build. It was also thought that he wore spectacles. In the hopes that someone would come forward and identify the man, a sketch was circulated throughout Sudbury. On February 11, 1998, 2 weeks after the crime, Sudbury police declared that they had charged 31-year-old John Fetterly with killing Renee. Soon after, police acknowledged their error and let him go. It was declared the next day that the evidence was insufficient to pin John Fetterly to the crime. When more and more people became aware of the case, the reward for information was increased from $25,000 to $30,000. Even though the culprit's DNA had been gathered by investigators, the National DNA Database did not yield a match. Every 30 days, Greater Sudbury police officers kept checking the databases. In order to rule out men in the area, investigators asked them to submit a DNA sample in 1999. When hundreds of men provided their DNA to Sudbury police on December 2, 1999, it was the biggest DNA collection ever for a single police investigation in Canadian history. Michael Wayne McGray, a serial offender from New Brunswick, was identified as a potential suspect in Renee's case on March 23, 2000. He was found guilty of killing 7 other people. However, no hard evidence connecting him to Renee's murder was discovered. In an effort to gather information about the crime, Sudbury Police launched the ReneeSweeney.com website on April 30, 2003. The family of Renee endured an excruciating wait for justice. In 2006, Carol A. Strachan, Renee's mother, released a CD of music called Remembering Renee Sweeney. In 2017, Kim Sweeney, her sister, stated that she had little memory of the hours, days, and weeks that followed the announcement of Renee's horrible ordeal. Kim received a call from her stepfather while she was at school, informing her that something untoward had occurred and she should return home. Her initial assumption was that something had to have happened to her multiple sclerosis mother. "I had a bad feeling about the whole thing and wondered why I was not being told to go to the hospital instead. But I got in my car and headed home right away anyways," she explained. "I would usually drive past Renee's work, but for some reason, I did not that day." She knew something more was wrong when she arrived at the house and heard her mother sobbing. "They told me that Renee had been shot because that's what they thought initially," Kim continued. "So I went to grab my coat, wondering why we're all just standing around the house. But then they told me she wasn't with us anymore, and I just dropped to my knees. From that day forward, our lives changed forever. My mom never walked again. She said it was just too hard for her to deal with. Her condition deteriorated pretty badly after, and she never really came back from it. And in November 2017, our mother passed away without ever finding out who took her daughter's life. I wish that she had a chance to close that book," Kim said. Kim had few surviving family members after Renee's multiple sclerosis afflicted biological father committed suicide in 1990, and her stepfather passed away recently. She claims that the fact that her own 2 small children will never have the opportunity to meet their aunt is what breaks her heart the most. She said they would have adored her, and she would have loved them. She ponders where Renee would be now and what she would have done with her life. "I still think about it and her every day," said Kim. "I just keep having these same questions run through my head. Why would someone do this? Why her? Is he still out there? I think that sometimes people just don't want to get involved, but I can't express how important it would be to finally get justice for my sister." She concluded, "If there is any information or anyone who remembers anything, I hope they remember and realize that the case has not been closed." The Greater Sudbury Police Service revealed in 2017 that it had partnered with Virginia-based technology startup Parabon Nanolabs, which specializes in DNA phenotyping. They unveiled a composite drawing of the offender on January 23, 2017, which was made possible by DNA technology known as phenotyping. The phrase describes a method that uses DNA evidence to forecast a suspect's appearance. The composite sketch, according to Greater Sudbury Police Constable Megan O'Malley, has given authorities a more precise picture of the suspect's physical characteristics. "We do know that he is of European descent, that he has light skin. He has either blue or green eyes, brown or blonde hair, and might have freckles." Following the image's increased public interest in the case, Sudbury Police received 360 tips from the public between 2017 and 2018. About 200 potential suspects were culled from those tips via DNA testing or other methods. In 2018, the lead investigator on the case, Detective Sergeant Robert Weston, stated, "The fact that this has gone unsolved for 20 years is mind-blowing and frustrating at the same time." He added that although it is challenging to look into a crime that occurred so long ago, he is committed to moving the case along and finding the person who committed it. The more you get involved in a case like this, you almost build a relationship somewhat with the victim. At the end of the day, the focus is on Renee. I still remain confident that the suspect will be identified. By the end of 2018, detectives had investigated thousands of tips and excluded 1,800 individuals. After 20 years, most people thought the suspect would never be apprehended, so it came as a surprise when Sudbury police announced on December 12, 2018, that they had taken 38-year-old Robert Stephen Wright into custody and were charging him of killing Renee. His DNA was identical to that of the offender. At the time of the murder, Wright was an 18-year-old student at Lockerbie Composite School. He was a lab technician in North Bay when he was arrested. When Robert Wright was taken into custody, Chief of Police Paul Pedersen stated, "We have been actively investigating information and tips throughout the past 20 years, and up until today. Wright has made a number of court appearances since then. Both in May 2020 and March 2019, he was refused bail. A judge decided on October 8, 2020, that Wright's trial would take place in Sudbury. This came after his attorneys requested a change of venue, claiming that the city's extensive media coverage would make it challenging to find an impartial jury. On February 21, 2023, Robert Stephen Wright's trial finally began. Wright denied having any part in Renee's murder. He said that, on January 27, 1998, in the early morning, he was concluding an exam at Lockerbie High School in Sudbury. Wright claimed that on the chilly morning after his exam, he was dressed in a long-sleeved t-shirt, jeans, running shoes, gloves, and a teal jacket. Robert Wright declared he had some free time and made the decision to visit the Paris Street adults-only video store. Wright testified that because the store's doors were covered and dark, he was unable to see inside before going in. Wright testified in court that as soon as he walked into the store, he saw video boxes scattered all over the carpet. The next thing he claimed to have noticed was that something had spilled onto the floor, but he claimed that his mind had not yet registered the possibility that it might have been blood. Wright claimed that he continued to look around the store after seeing Renee Sweeney's body lying on the ground. Robert Wright testified before the jury that he approached Sweeney's body to feel for a pulse and to see if she was still breathing. He claimed this was something he had learned as a Boy Scout. He claimed he shook Renee's shoulder with his right hand and inquired as to her well-being, but in the end, he claimed he was unable to feel anything, neither a pulse nor a breath. Wright abruptly claimed to have retreated from Renee, overwhelmed. He admitted to the court that he was terrified when he saw blood on his jacket. "I ran because I was terrified," he testified in court. "I was a foolish child. I wished I had stayed. I'm not sure what was going through my mind. At that point, I felt completely overwhelmed. All I wanted to do was get away." Wright testified before the jury that he had to steady himself after backing away from the body and that he couldn't recall what he was holding. Since a fingerprint matching Wright's DNA was discovered on a cash tray on the counter, Wright was questioned about it. Wright added that he wasn't sure what he grabbed onto while attempting to steady himself and that he wasn't aware of the tray. Wright denied stealing anything from the store and denied flipping the money clips on the cash tray up. The next thing he recalled, he claimed, was squatting down, grabbing his teal jacket and gloves, and taking off. He was questioned about his decision to throw away his gloves and jacket. "At that moment, I became aware that I had fled a crime scene, and I was afraid I would be charged. I've never made a worse choice than to run. I'm not even sure if I made that choice on purpose," he said. Following that, Wright claimed he had considered visiting a friend's house for a short while, but changed his mind because he didn't want to involve anyone else. He claimed that from the city center mall in downtown Sudbury, he rode the first bus home to Valcarran. Wright claimed that afternoon, when he got home, the house was empty. He testified in court that he never disclosed what had happened to anyone, not even his parents. "All I wanted to do was put the whole thing behind me and move on. It was extremely traumatic. I was embarrassed to run, and I also didn't want to worry them." The story by Robert Wright had a lot of contradictions. How his DNA ended up in the restroom and under Renee's fingernails was not explained. Furthermore, it did not clarify how his fingerprints came to be beneath the cash box. Moreover, no other person was observed at the crime scene, and no additional DNA was discovered. He was found guilty of every charge brought against him on March 29, 2023. The jury deliberated for slightly over a day before returning its verdict in the Sudbury courthouse. A cheer erupted from the Sweeney family side of the courtroom, and people began giving each other heartfelt hugs. Wright's father waved meekly, and his mother had tears in her eyes as they watched their 43-year-old son being led out of the courtroom by police officers. Reporters were informed by Kim, Renee's sister, and her smiling family friend, Kelly Irvine, that they were overjoyed and ecstatic with the jury's verdict. Following the verdict, Kelly Irvine declared, "After what horribly happened 25 years ago, Renee Sweeney got justice today." On June 29, 2023, Judge Robbie Gordon sentenced Robert Stephen Wright to 25 years in prison. The final words in Renee's victim statement came from her sister, Kim. "Do you know what it's like to have lost your best friend? I have searched the English dictionary for words to express the misery that losing Renee has brought to my family, but none exists. I had to be reminded of the brutality by glancing at that jacket that had my sister's blood on it. I'm requesting that you give him the harshest punishment you can. A quarter of our lives have been lost. He ought to be given 25 years to reflect on his actions."